Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on monopolizing the afterlife, power dynamics with ancient Egyptian funerary books. So the belief that one would achieve rebirth through divine transfiguration and reach the field of reeds after death was a fundamental concept in ancient Egyptian society. To attain immortality and this heavenly paradise, however, the deceased had to endure a long and perilous journey through the underworld where they would be judged on their morality. To prepare for such a journey, funerary books composed of ritualistic spells were created to guide the deceased into the afterlife, but such works were originally only available to royalty. Known in Egyptology as the pyramid text, this funerary book is found inscribed on the tomb walls of kings and queens of the late Old Kingdom. During the succeeding historical period, the spells were written on the coffins of the elite due to the decentralization with the rise and power of provincial governors, forming a new edition of funerary books known as the coffin text. By the time of the New Kingdom, funerary books became available to anyone who could afford them through another edition, the Book of the Dead, since the substrate changed to papyrus. But the monarchy again attempted to control the attainment and pleasures of the afterlife by creating a new group of funerary books inscribed on royal tomb walls that generated new secrets about the journey and the divine, known as the netherworld books and the books of the sky. By examining Egypt's extensive and diverse book culture, which does challenge traditional Western concepts of the book, it becomes evident that there was a strong attempt by royalty to continuously monopolize the achievement of immortality and the afterlife. But what are ancient Egyptian funerary books? Well, they first appeared during the Old Kingdom at the end of Dynasty 5, so around 2345 BCE, with the Pyramid of King Unas, and were likely born out of the want to have exclusive royal possession over the benefits and pleasures of the afterlife to ensure eternal existence. And funerary books, which fall under the Egyptological category of funerary literature, are literary works that deal with eschatology, primarily that which guided the deceased into the next life and live among the divine. More specifically, ascending to the sky to join the sun god Re on a solar bark and being received by the gods as a newly divine figure. Ultimately, the books are compilations of ritualistic spells, also referred to as utterances, incantations, or recitations, and they were designed to guide the deceased into the afterlife and achieve rebirth through transfiguration into an Ak, the effective spirit. Their primary use was to be read aloud by lector priests, so male priests who recited spells and hymns at rituals and ceremonies, and they were read aloud before and during burial, serving as the funerary rituals. And the goal was to ensure immortality after death by performing rites that allowed the deceased spirit to be reborn, existing in both the terrestrial and spiritual planes. In terms of the materiality, it changed over the various periods and dynasties of ancient Egyptian history. But we do notice a return back to tradition because funerary books were originally inscribed on stone, then shifted to be painting on wood, then papyrus, but then back again to stone 1,000 years after its original appearance. And some of you might be thinking, well, how can stone or stone inscriptions be considered a book since it does not conform to the traditional notions of the book in book historical scholarship? As I'm aware that there are quite a few book historians who discard stone inscriptions from being books simply because they are written on an immobile surface. Yet, contrary to these sentiments, in ancient Egypt, stone was a fundamental writing surface for literary works. So in order to reprimand the seemingly yet incomprehensible, mutually exclusive nature of Egyptology and book history, the conceptual framework that I employ to challenge semantic concepts in the field in order to be inclusive of ancient Egyptian book culture, concepts which are ultimately rooted in Western bias and modern constructs, I employ the notion of book as idea. Viewing book as an idea rather than solely an object avoids the predisposed Western bias of equating book to codex, which brings with it the traditional skewed belief that a book must only be considered in terms of leaves bound together and thus being a portable object. This book as idea notion also counts for intangible books, so oral literature, born digital works, and it is unrestrictive towards book mediums because it essentially allows any substrate to function as a book carrier. And so what I often argue is not that stone itself is the book, but merely its substrate. The ideas that are being transposed textually and or pictorially onto the stone is the book. So in this case, the ritualistic spells and their pictorial accompaniments of funerary books. So to look at ancient Egyptian funerary books' chronological appearance, as previously mentioned, they are first seen in the Old Kingdom and are referred to as pyramid texts because it is first found in the pyramid tombs of kings, then queens, and then later it begins to appear on the tomb walls of coffins of officials. In the first intermediate period, so around 2180 BCE, we see the emergence of a new edition of funerary books, known as the coffin text, because it is found on wooden coffins of the elite. During the end of the second intermediate period, so around 1600 BCE, is the emergence of the most famous edition of funerary books known today, the Book of the Dead, which is written on papyrus rolls that were not only commissioned by the elite, but also by the middle class, depending on what they could afford in terms of detail and length. So up to this point, what we see, what Egyptologists like to term, is the democratization of the afterlife, because the spells have become more widely available in society, and because the achievement of the afterlife, along with its benefits, gradually no longer become monopolized by royalty, though clearly monopolized by the elite, since they were, for the most part, the only ones who could afford to commission these labor and detail-intensive books. However, something that Egyptologists forget to account for in this phenomenon of democratizing the afterlife is that when we reach the New Kingdom, there are two new collections of funerary books exclusive to royal use until Dynasty 21 of the succeeding period, known as the Third Intermediate Period. These collections of books are the Netherworld books, which first appear in Dynasty 18, and the Books of the Sky, which appear first in Dynasty 19. Both collections are only found on tomb walls of kings. And then we see some examples of these funerary books being inscribed on sarcophagi, but again, only on sarcophagi of kings. The creation of these new funerary books demonstrates a reattempt of royal monopoly over the afterlife, and to a greater extreme than with the pyramid text, because it is evident that the Netherworld books and the Books of the Sky were reserved solely for the king. None of the New Kingdom queens have these books inscribed on their tomb walls in the Valley of the Queens. Instead, they only have chapters from the Book of the Dead. So what we see is not only renewed royal ambition to have control over the afterlife, but gender inequality, as the queens were not given the luxury to know the newly generated secrets about the divine and the journey through the underworld, suppressing queens' attainment of the same afterlife as that of the kings. There are many funerary books, which makes up the collection of the Netherworld books. There's the Litany of Re, also known as the Book of Adoring Re in the West, the Amduat, also known as the Book of the Hidden Chamber. There's also the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, the Book of the Earth, or also known as the Creation of the Solar Disk, and the enigmatic Book of the Netherworld, or also known as the Books of the Solar of Syrian Unity. Each of these books deal with specific themes that originally appear in the pyramid text, the coffin text, and the Book of the Dead, but discuss them in a more elaborate nature. The main focus of all of these books is the nightly journey of the sun, in which the nocturnal regeneration of the sun god demonstrates what powers of creation and renewal are at work in the afterlife. But the journey also occurs within the framework of the human spirit, which achieves rebirth from the underworld into the hereafter. The emphasis clearly lies on the odyssey of the soul, because the sun god descends into the underworld in the form of his Ba, his manifested spirit, and therefore the king's sole possession of these books and their spells allows him to mimic the sun god's journey as if it is his own, and creates an even stronger affinity with the divine to achieve immortality. Likewise, there are a few books that make up the collection of the Books of the Sky. There's the Book of Nu, the Book of the Day, and the Book of the Night, the latter two nominally placed next to each other on the ceiling of the tomb. These books instead center on representations of the sky goddess Nut, transposing the nightly journey of the sun god into her body, and thus into a celestial hereafter rather than focusing on the underworld. Nut is known for giving birth to the rejuvenated sun in the morning and swallowing him during the evening, her body being a conduit for his journey, which is visible during the day and invisible during the night. Although there is still continued focus on the sun god, and there are similar motifs and landscape from the netherworld books, there is a new emphasis on the cosmography and topography of the sky, an additional focus on other celestial bodies. There's also another text which is viewed as a special composition, the Book of the Heavenly Cow, but focuses on the same deities as the Book of the Sky, just in a different narrative. This book explains the rebellion of humankind against the sun god and its subsequent punishment by the fiery eye of Re, known as the goddess Hathor, causing death, suffering, and the sun god's withdrawal into the sky on the back of the celestial cow Nut, who would now have to be supported by various deities and the pharaoh himself. Now, with the king already having control over the terrestrial realm in life, the netherworld books granted him control over the underworld, the subterrestrial realm, as all its secrets, deities, and demons were revealed. The books of the sky and the Book of the Heavenly Cow granted the king control over the remaining realm, the celestial, as they afforded him a filial relation with the sky goddess due to his mimicking of the sun god's birth from Nut. The Book of the Heavenly Cow in particular emphasizes the royal role of the sun god, which directly relates back to the king because in life he was viewed as the son and successor of Re, and in death the king withdrew to the sky just like the sun god, dwelling in the celestial afterlife for eternity with his divine father. Having sole possession of these books granted the king a variety of ways to achieve rebirth via the sun god's cyclical renewal, either emerging from the underworld in the eastern horizon or emerging from the womb of the sky goddess Nut in the sky, ultimately providing the king's Akh, his effective spirit, with extensive regenerative powers. The books also emphasize the king's otherworldly purpose in death, as he also becomes a double of the sun god and plays an important role in the sky, whether that is being the sun itself or upholding the sky. After Dynasty 21, these royal books become democratized like the funerary books before them. But again, there was this restriction to the elite. In particular, this time, there was a focus on the priesthood. A prime example is the Amduat, as it was first monopolized by priests of Amun, the most powerful priesthood at the time, which resided in Thebes. And then it trickled down to officials, and then was briefly used again by kings of Dynasty 30, but going back to non-royal use in Ptolemaic Egypt, so after the Greek conquest. The priests of Amun, in fact, composed an entirely new book known as the Books of Breathing, which was handed down specifically within the priesthood alone. Nearly all the remaining copies date to the Greco-Roman period and were still composed by the Theban priests during that period. The book stressed the importance of breathing for the deceased to enable them to continue to exist in the afterlife by prolonging the existence of their name, which avoided the second death and thus damnation. Breathing being a metaphorical term for all the aspects of life that the deceased hoped to experience again in the hereafter. The book ultimately served as an identity card in the underworld, with the result that the divine accepted the deceased into their company. So here, the priests of Amun have created a special pass for themselves in the underworld so that through the aid of the supreme god Amun, Osiris, the god of the underworld, would ensure that the eternal survival of the priests Ba, their manifested spirit. So what we see happening with most of the royal funerary books after the New Kingdom is that extracts were taken and placed on tomb walls, sarcophagi, coffins, or papyri of the elite, rather than having a complete reproduction of an entire book for the elite. And again, we see this gendered restriction because no queens, priestesses, or elite women are found possessing these books, only the Book of the Dead. There is an interesting case, however, when Amenirtis I, the god's wife of Amun during Dynasty 25, so the highest ranking priestess of the Amun cult, has selections of the pyramid text inscribed on her funerary chapel at Medina Habu. It's quite an enigma because no god's wife of Amun before her has selections of the pyramid text inscribed, but rather it is the male officials attached to the state of the god's wife. And then there is only one god's wife from Dynasty 26 after Amenerdes has selections inscribed on her sarcophagi. The selections were completely adapted to suit the god's wife's feminine gender, in which the spells brought her senses back to life and provided her with food, cold water, incense, and all the proper insignia needed for her to achieve the afterlife. So for almost 1,000 years, we see gender inequality with regards to the attainment of the afterlife and its journey, making the journey harder for women since they didn't have access to all the secrets or privileges granted originally to the king in the hereafter. But clearly, there is a special case that challenges this exclusion and makes me wonder if there are other examples out there, and we simply just don't know about them because they've either been lost to us or are still buried and hidden in Egypt. We can see that the creation and use of funerary books becomes a prime example of the power dynamics evident in ancient Egyptian society. Funerary books begin with being solely reserved for royalty, namely kings and queens. Then there is a linear democratization of the afterlife via the gradual spread of funerary books across the different levels of society until the New Kingdom, when there was a return to Old Kingdom practices with royal exclusivity on tomb walls and as well as on some sarcophagi. And though the creation of the netherworld books and the books of the sky mimicked funerary books' original use, there was a clear divergence from Old Kingdom practice in terms of gender restriction because these funerary books were solely reserved for kings, restricted from the queens. Post-New Kingdom sees a return to democratization with elite monopoly and continued gender inequality, but there are some rare cases where female use is present. And what these funerary books demonstrate is not only that kings were constantly trying to monopolize the afterlife by possessing new spells that would provide them more affordances in the hereafter via increased regenerative powers and association with the divine, but that the successful achievement of the afterlife was based on social status. If you were part of the elite, then you had access to the spells necessary to guide you through the underworld because you had enough wealth to commission a funerary book for yourself. And depending on your societal position, the closer access you had to the king, the more direct was your access to the benefits of the afterlife, because there are some examples in the New Kingdom where viziers of the king were actually given access to the netherworld books in their tombs on account of the royal relationship. So while every Egyptian theoretically was able to achieve the afterlife by living a moral life, the way in which the deceased journeyed through the underworld, whether with ease or with difficulty, and the types of benefits and pleasures received in the afterlife was based on who created or who was provided access to the spells that granted divine transfiguration. Thank you.